She waited until the exact moment I was happiest. That is what I cannot get over, even now. Not just what she did, but the timing of it, the surgical, deliberate, almost artistic cruelty of choosing my wedding day. The moment I was standing in a white dress with flowers in my hair and tears of joy in my eyes, to reach into my chest and rip out everything I believed about myself. My sister Camille grabbed the microphone from the DJ, tapped it twice so the feedback squeal silenced every conversation in the room. And then she smiled at me from across that beautifully decorated hall and said, "Before we toast the bride, I think the guests deserve to know something our father was too cowardly to say out loud. Nadia was adopted. She has no blood connection to this family, and she has absolutely no legal or moral claim to a single dollar of our father's estate." 300 people went silent. My husband, Daniel, froze beside me, his hand suddenly unsure in mine. And I stood there in a dress I had saved for 11 months to buy, on the most important day of my life, and felt the entire floor disappear beneath my feet. That was 8 months ago. Let me tell you what happened after. My name is Nadia Rousseau. I am 31 years old. I grew up in a 3-story house in a quiet suburb outside of Lyon, France, though we moved to Toronto when I was 6 and my sister Camille was 9. My father, Gerard Rousseau, was a self-made man in the truest sense of the phrase. He started with nothing but a second-hand truck and a willingness to work 18-hour days. And by the time I was a teenager, he owned a mid-sized logistics company that employed over 200 people. He was not a perfect man. He was distracted sometimes, buried in spreadsheets and phone calls during dinners, absent for school plays, missing from parent-teacher conferences. But he loved fiercely and quietly, the way some men do. Through packed lunches left on the counter before sunrise and $20 bills slipped under bedroom doors and long Sunday drives where he would say almost nothing but somehow made you feel completely seen. My mother, Isabel, died when I was 4. I have almost no memory of her. Just a smell, something floral and warm, like a garden after rain, and a feeling of being held so completely that nothing in the world could touch you. After she died, it was just the 3 of us. Papa, Camille, and me. We grew up together in that grief, which I always thought made us close. I was wrong about a lot of things. Camille was the beautiful one. That is not me being self-deprecating. It is just the truth. She had my mother's cheekbones, Papa's dark eyes, and that particular quality some people have where a room arranges itself around them when they walk in. She was charming, effortlessly social, the kind of person who collects friends and admirers the way some people collect stamps. I was quieter. I liked books and long walks and conversations that went somewhere real. I studied accounting at university, which most people found impressively boring. I was not the sister people remembered. I was the one who remembered everyone else. For most of our lives, Camille and I were not close, but we were not enemies. We were more like 2 planets in the same solar system, aware of each other's gravity, respectful of each other's orbit, occasionally sharing the same sky at family dinners and holidays, but mostly moving in different directions. I thought that was fine. I thought that was just how some siblings were. I did not know she had been keeping a secret about me for years, and I did not know she planned to use it as a weapon. Papa got sick in the spring of the year I turned 30. It was his heart, a series of small failures that the doctors had been monitoring for 2 years, but which suddenly accelerated into something serious. He was hospitalized in March, came home in April, and by May he was spending most of his days in the armchair by the window, reading and sleeping and watching the birds at the feeder he had installed in the backyard years ago because I once mentioned, casually, that I liked cardinals. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes from watching a strong person become fragile. If you have experienced it, you know exactly what I mean. If you have not, I hope you never do. I moved back into the family house that summer to help care for him. Daniel, who I had been dating for 3 years at that point, was patient and understanding in a way that made me love him even more. He drove out on weekends, brought food, sat with Papa while I ran errands, and never once made me feel like I was asking too much. Camille, who lived 40 minutes away in a beautiful condo she had bought with money Papa had gifted her for her 30th birthday, visited on occasional Sunday afternoons. She would bring expensive pastries from the patisserie near her building, stay for an hour or 2, and then leave. She was not unkind during those visits. She was just not particularly present. I remember one afternoon in July when Papa had a particularly bad day and I called her, scared, not sure if I should phone the doctor. She let it ring 4 times and then texted back, "He's probably just tired. Let him rest." He was not just tired. He had a minor cardiac episode that required a call to his medical team and a medication adjustment, but I handled it alone, the way I was handling most things alone. And I told myself Camille was just overwhelmed by the situation in her own way, and that grief and fear affect people differently. I was always making excuses for her. That was one of my worst habits. In September, Papa called us both into his study. He was sitting up in his chair, dressed properly for the first time in weeks, which I recognized as his way of signaling that something important was about to happen. He told us he had updated his will. He told us he had met with his lawyer, a composed and meticulous man named Mr. Fortier, and that his affairs were in order. He told us he loved us both. He told us there were some things about the past he wished he had handled differently, and that he hoped we would understand, eventually, that everything he had ever done had been done from love. I held his hand. I told him I already understood. I meant it completely. Camille asked him what the will said. He told her that Mr. Fortier would explain everything after he was gone. She pressed him. He shook his head gently and said only that he wanted peace, not paperwork, for whatever time he had left. Camille smiled tightly and said, of course, whatever you want, Papa. But I saw her jaw. I saw the way it set like concrete, and I saw, though I did not yet understand it, the decision crystallizing behind her eyes. Papa died in October, quietly, in his armchair, on a Tuesday afternoon with golden light coming through the window and a cardinal on the feeder outside. I had stepped into the kitchen to make tea. I was gone for perhaps 4 minutes. When I came back, he was already still. I have thought about those 4 minutes every day since. The grief was enormous and ordinary at the same time, the way the deepest griefs often are. I cried until I had nothing left. I handled the arrangements because no one else was going to. I called the funeral home, the lawyers, the relatives, the employees at Papa's company who had known him for decades. I wrote the obituary. I chose the music. I stood at the reception afterward and accepted condolences from 200 people while Camille stood on the other side of the room, radiant and tragic in the way beautiful people often manage to be, collecting sympathy like flowers. I did not begrudge her that. I was just tired. And Daniel had just asked me to marry him, quietly and privately 3 days before Papa passed, a ring he had been carrying for weeks. A moment that arrived draped in both joy and sorrow in the way that the most honest moments of a life sometimes do. We set the wedding for the following spring. 8 months away. I thought it would give us all time to grieve and then time to celebrate. I thought it would be a soft and healing thing for the whole family. I thought that because I was, apparently, extraordinarily naive. The trouble started before Papa was even in the ground. 2 days after his death, Camille called me and asked, very casually, whether I had looked at the will yet. I told her we needed to wait for Mr. Fortier to contact us. She said she had a right to know what was in it. I agreed but told her it was not my information to share, since I did not know it myself. She told me Papa had mentioned, years ago, that he intended to split everything equally. She wanted to confirm that was still the plan. I told her I assumed so. She said she needed more than an assumption. I said, Camille, our father just died. Can we give it a few days? She said she had responsibilities and financial obligations and that she needed clarity. I said I would call Mr. Fortier's office the following week. She said fine. But her voice had that texture to it that I recognized from childhood, a thin surface smoothness over something hot and moving underneath. The meeting with Mr. Fortier happened 3 weeks later. Camille arrived in a cream blazer with her hair blown out, which I noted only because of how deliberate she was about appearances when she wanted to make an impression. Mr. Fortier was exactly as I remembered him, silver-haired, measured. With the calm of someone who has delivered difficult news enough times that he has made peace with its necessity. He opened the file. He explained that Papa's company shares would be liquidated and the proceeds divided, but not equally. 60% to me. 40% to Camille. He also explained that the family home, which was paid off and valued at approximately $1.2 million, was to be transferred to my name. Camille went very still. She asked Mr. Fortier to repeat himself. He did, in the same measured tone. She turned to me and said, "Did you know about this?" I told her honestly that I had not. She said she did not believe me. I said that was her right, but it was also the truth. She said nothing for the rest of the meeting. She thanked Mr. Fortier in a voice so controlled it was almost impressive. She walked out to the parking lot, and then she sat in her car for 45 minutes. I know because I watched from the window of the lawyer's building. Not out of cruelty but out of worry, because she was my sister and she had just received a shock and I wanted to make sure she was safe. She was not crying. That more than anything, should have told me something. She was on her phone, making calls. She reached out 2 days later with a theory. She told me she had done some research and believed Papa had changed his will under duress, while his health was declining, possibly under my influence. She used the phrase undue influence. She said it carefully, like she had practiced it. I asked her what exactly she was accusing me of. She said she was not accusing me of anything. She was simply raising a concern. I told her that concern was an accusation in a more expensive coat, and she should be direct with me. She said she simply thought a court might be interested in the fact that I had been living in the house, managing Papa's affairs, and was in a position to shape his decisions. I told her that was called caregiving, and that if she had wanted to have more influence on Papa's final years, she was welcome to have shown up for them. There was a very long silence. Then she said, in a voice I did not recognize, "You have no idea how much I know, Nadia. Be careful." She hung up. I sat with those words for 3 days. I did not understand them yet, but I felt them, the way you feel a change in weather before you can see the clouds. I told Daniel. He held me and told me we would figure it out. He suggested I call Mr. Fortier and explain the situation. I did. Mr. Fortier said the will was airtight, executed properly with witnesses and full documentation of Papa's cognitive clarity, and that any challenge would be expensive, time-consuming, and extremely unlikely to succeed. He said it with the confidence of someone who had written the document himself. I felt better. That was, looking back, a small and temporary comfort, because Camille was not building a legal case. She was building something else entirely. The months between Papa's death and my wedding were outwardly normal. I moved back to my apartment with Daniel. I dealt with the estate paperwork. I worked my job at a mid-sized accounting firm where I had been employed for 5 years. I planned a wedding. And Camille was quiet, distantly pleasant when we had to interact over estate matters. Not warm, but not openly hostile. I thought, foolishly, that she was processing her grief and her disappointment and slowly coming to terms with things. I even reached out twice to suggest we have lunch. She declined politely, citing a busy schedule. I sent her a wedding invitation with a handwritten note inside, telling her that whatever was between us, she was my sister, and I wanted her there. She RSVP'd, yes. I thought that meant something. I was wrong about that too. The wedding was in May. A Saturday, sunny with just enough breeze to keep it from being too warm, the kind of day that feels like a personal gift from the universe. We had 300 guests, Daniel's family who I adored, our friends, old colleagues, some extended relatives I had not seen in years. The ceremony was small and private, just family, but the reception was the celebration. I had worked so hard to make it beautiful. Ivory tablecloths and greenery and candles and a live jazz quartet that Daniel had surprised me with. I was happy. I was genuinely, completely happy. We had done the first dance. We had eaten. Toasts had been made. Daniel's best man had been funny and warm. My friend Priya had made me cry with her speech about how I deserved every beautiful thing. And then, just as the DJ was transitioning back into music and people were beginning to move to the dance floor, Camille stood up. She took the microphone. I thought she was going to give a toast. I thought, for one bright foolish second, that she was finally offering me something real. Before we continue celebrating, she said, her voice carrying perfectly across the room because Camille has always known how to command space. I think there's something the family deserves to know. Something our father chose to keep hidden. Something that I believe affects the legitimacy of the inheritance he left. The room had already started going quiet. 300 people, trained by instinct to recognize the gravity in a voice. Nadia was adopted at the age of 2. She is not our father's biological daughter. She has no blood connection to the Rousseau family. And I believe it's time we asked some honest questions about why she was left the majority of an estate she has no natural claim to. She set the microphone down. She folded her hands on the table in front of her and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfaction dressed up as sorrow. And the room just breathed. That collective inhalation of 300 people processing something they did not expect, and then the silence. I remember Daniel's hand in mine. I remember it tightening, not loosening, and that small fact saved something in me in that moment. I remember my friend Priya's face, turned toward me from 3 tables away, her expression asking me a question she could not say out loud. I remember the heat in my face, and the cold in my chest, and the very specific sensation of not knowing whether to cry or scream or simply evaporate. I did none of those things. I stood up. I do not know where it came from, the steadiness, but I stood up and I looked at Camille across the room, and I said, clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "Thank you for telling me. Now sit down. This is my wedding." And then I nodded to the DJ. And the music started, and I pulled Daniel onto the dance floor. I held myself together for 4 more hours. I smiled and danced and thanked people for coming and accepted the awkward hugs of relatives who did not know what to say. I was gracious. I was composed. I was inside, completely shattered. Daniel and I left at midnight. In the car on the way to the hotel where we were spending the night before our honeymoon flight, I finally fell apart. I cried the way I cried when Papa died. That deep, physical, full-body kind of grief that leaves you feeling scraped clean. Daniel held me the entire drive. He said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "Whatever she said up there, you are who you are. Nothing she says changes who you are." I held on to those words. But there was a question now that I could not unhold. Was it true? Was I adopted? The morning after the wedding, before we flew to Portugal for our honeymoon, I called Mr. Fortier's emergency number. Yes, I had it, because I am a thorough person and I had learned to be prepared. I left a message. He called back, within the hour. I asked him directly, was there anything about my birth or my legal status as Papa's daughter that I needed to know? There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. He said carefully, "Nadia, your father asked me to keep certain things sealed until he felt you were ready, and then he passed before he could decide when that time was. There is a second envelope. It has been in my possession since he updated his will. I think you should come in." We postponed our flight by 1 day. Daniel, without a single word of complaint, postponed our flight by 1 day. We sat in Mr. Fortier's office the morning after my wedding, still in the soft days of the night before, and he placed a sealed envelope on the desk in front of me. My name was written on the outside in my father's handwriting. Just Nadia, in his particular, slightly slanted script that I would recognize anywhere. I opened it with hands that shook, and I read, and I have to stop here to collect myself, even now, thinking about what was inside, because it was not what I expected. I expected legal language, documents, proof of adoption, perhaps, cold administrative facts. What I found was a letter, 7 pages. In Papa's handwriting, he began by saying that there was no easy way to say what he was about to say, and that he had written and rewritten this letter 40 times in the past 2 years, and that none of the versions felt right, because none of them could adequately hold what he felt. He told me that yes, I was adopted. I was 2 years old. My biological mother was a young woman named Sophie, who had been a close friend of my mother Isabel's. Sophie had become pregnant in difficult circumstances and was not able to raise a child. Isabel, my mother, the one who died, the one I remembered only as warmth and flowers, had been the first person Sophie called. And Isabel had said yes before Sophie had even finished asking, because Isabel, who had struggled for years with fertility, had once told Sophie that if she ever found a child who needed a home, she would say yes, and she meant it. And then Papa wrote something that undid me entirely. He wrote, "You were not the child we could not have. You were the child we chose. Every single day, Nadia, every single day of your life, we chose you. Your mother chose you first. And when I lost her, you were the piece of her I was allowed to keep. You have her laugh. I don't know how, but you do. And every time I heard it, I got to have her back for just a moment. I was a coward for not telling you sooner. I was afraid of what you might feel. But you were never anything less than entirely, completely mine." He wrote that the reason for the will division, the 60%, the house, was not guilt. It was not compensation. It was because Camille had always been financially reckless. A quality he loved about her and worried about, in equal measure. And he had made arrangements in separate accounts to support her over time, rather than give her access to a large sum at once. He wrote that this was detailed in a supplementary document Mr. Fortier had. He wrote that he knew Camille might not understand immediately, but that he trusted she would eventually. He was more generous than she deserved. He wrote that he had always meant to tell me the truth himself, face to face, and that he was sorry he had run out of time. He wrote that he loved me. He wrote it 3 times, in 3 different ways, as if once was not sufficient. It was not, and yet somehow it was everything. I sat in Mr. Fortier's office and I cried until I laughed, and then I cried again. Daniel held my hand the entire time and did not try to fill the silence. Mr. Fortier quietly provided tissues and coffee and asked no unnecessary questions. And when I finally finished, when I was empty and cleaned out and curiously light, I looked at the envelope and I thought about Camille. I thought about what she had done. At my wedding, in front of everyone. with something she had known, apparently, for some time, because if she had done her research, if she had discovered this, she had done it deliberately and saved it for maximum damage. She had built a weapon out of my origin and fired it at the moment she calculated would hurt me most. And she had framed it as truth-telling. She had framed it as fairness. She had stood in front of 300 people and humiliated me under the cover of honesty, when what she actually wanted was the money. The 60% she felt she deserved. The house she felt she had a claim to. And she had thought, I am certain of this, that exposing my adoption would either invalidate my inheritance legally, or at minimum turn the family against me so thoroughly that I would feel pressured to concede. She had been calculating this for months. The quiet, the polite declined lunches, the composed presence at my wedding, all of it had been preparation. The version of me from before that letter might have cried about it and tried to forgive it and moved on. The version of me who had just read my father's handwriting, 7 pages of it telling me I was chosen and loved and entirely his, that version of me was done being quiet. I asked Mr. Fortier to make me a copy of the letter and the supplementary financial documents. He had them ready. He had been expecting this, I think. He is a perceptive man. Daniel and I flew to Portugal the next morning. We had a honeymoon. A real one, 10 days of sea and wine, and long dinners and walking through old cities with no particular destination. I allowed myself those 10 days completely. I grieved my father properly. I cried on a beach in the Algarve about the letter and the laugh he said I had inherited and the cardinals and the 4 minutes I had been in the kitchen. I let Daniel love me in the uncomplicated way he does, which is one of the most healing things I have ever experienced, and I thought, quietly, carefully, thoroughly, I am an accountant. I am a thorough person. I do not act before I understand a situation completely. And when I understood this situation completely, I made a plan. The plan had 4 parts. The first part was information. When we returned from Portugal, I met with a lawyer, not Mr. Fortier, but an additional one recommended by a colleague, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Adami, who specialized in estate and family law. I brought her the will, the letter, and the supplementary documents. I told her what Camille had done. She listened without interrupting. Then she told me several things I found very useful. The first was that my adoption had no legal bearing whatsoever on my inheritance. I was legally adopted. I was legally Gerard Rousseau's daughter. The will was valid. Any challenge would fail, and she would personally enjoy watching it fail. The second was that Camille's public declaration at the wedding, depending on how it was framed and what effect it had, could potentially constitute defamation if it caused measurable harm to my reputation, to my relationships, to my professional standing. The third was that the supplementary documents Papa had left revealed something Camille did not know. Papa had set up a structured trust in Camille's name, one that would provide her with a monthly income for the rest of her life, managed by a financial trustee. It was generous. It was thoughtful. And its terms included a clause, written by Papa himself, that any legal challenge to the primary will result in the trust being dissolved. Papa had anticipated this. He had known his daughter. He had built her a safety net but made it contingent on her not being destructive. I sat with this information and felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite satisfaction. It was more like recognition. Like understanding something true about a person I had loved. Ms. Adorni for Ms. Adam Lee, filed the nicitens in a deprecol uller, which do what Miss Ade to adacidate, assets to. My name is Sarah and is the Dacidae, ASSO8s, to my picture freeway seaway stuff, with the freeway, Camila stash dash stef. And the clauses dash 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 and dash 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 dash. She also preferred. She also sent a letter. She also sent a letter. Informing Camille that any further public senses, regard and confines, and that if she prefer, and that if she prefer, and that if she chose to pursue an care some destricet, but we can depter to the language with careful, if we and we perceptui, a lot of, that was the first part. The second part was the family sides of assembly, the extended relative size did we prefer size the venitive that are reload, the antiphord do you prefer, the aunts and uncles and cousins, who would do with the aunts and uncles and cousins who had watched Camille take that microphone and had not known what to do or say. I am not that kind of person, but do you prefer duetto? But I also refused to let Camila Sige to prefer to Esther Briston of events, be the only one they had access to. We are letter with the letter we can sign. It took me 4 evening sessions to write 2 ways. I sent it but email, footy fime leave, in it? We preferred for that. Bop, we could do where we prefer. I told them abradi. I told them about my dester. I told them at the story of the stover and the stage of the story of the starters of the center of the lover and the lovers of the lovers of the lovers and the lovers of the setter of it. We good nice steak sizen, Samuel. I did not use the word vindictive or calculating or cruel, though all three applied. I simply shared my father's words with his blessing. I felt, since he had written them for exactly this purpose. I shared the passage about the laugh. I shared the passage about choosing me every single day. I told the family that I had spent 31 years being loved by a man who chose that love freely. And that nothing about that was less real or less valid for the manner of my arrival in his life. I asked them for nothing. I simply wanted them to know. 16 people responded. 15 of them with love, with apology, with their own memories of Papa and of me growing up. My Aunt Renata, Papa's sister, called me and cried for 20 minutes and said she had known about the adoption from the beginning. That she had always thought I deserved to be told directly, and that what Camille had done was unforgivable. The 16th person was Camille, who responded with 2 sentences. I see you've made your case to the family. I hope you're proud of yourself. I was, actually, quietly and without apology. The third part was the most delicate, and the one Daniel had gently questioned when I first told him about it. It involved the truth. Not just with family. With Camille, directly. I asked her to meet me. She said no, 3 times. The 4th time, I told her that if she did not meet with me, I would have no choice but to let the legal correspondence do all the communicating, and that Ms. Adami would be in touch regularly. She met me, a coffee shop, neutral ground. She arrived looking composed and sat across from me with her hands folded on the table. And I recognized suddenly that she was doing the exact same thing I was doing, presenting a controlled exterior over something turbulent and afraid. I had prepared what I was going to say, but when I sat across from her, I abandoned most of it. I said, I read Papa's letter. She said nothing. I said, he set up a trust for you. It's generous. Monthly income for life. But there's a clause, any legal challenge voids it. Ms. Adami's letter explained that. She nodded, barely perceptibly. I said, I'm not here to negotiate the estate. That's done. I'm here because you're my sister. And what you did at my wedding was one of the most deliberately cruel things anyone has ever done to me. And I need you to know that I know it was deliberate. I know you knew. I know you chose that moment. She looked at the table. First time since she sat down that she was not looking at me. She said, he gave you more. He always gave you more. You were always the one he worried about, the one he watched for. I was the one who was supposed to be fine, and I understood, in that moment, what I was actually sitting across from. Not a villain, a woman who had spent her entire life feeling like a visitor in her own family's love, who had lost her mother young, who had watched her father pour a particular quality of quiet attention onto her little sister and had translated that, in the way wounded people sometimes do, into being loved less, who had made that translation into grievance and then into weapon. She was wrong about it. She had been wrong about it her whole life. Papa had loved her, the trust proved it, the structured care of it, the lifetime of provision. He had simply loved her in a way that tried to protect her from herself. But that is not the conversation she and I could have in a coffee shop. That conversation, if it ever happens, will take years. I said, I need you to apologize. Not to me privately. To the family, to Daniel. You stood up at my wedding, in front of everyone who loves me, and you tried to burn it down. An apology to me in this coffee shop is not the same scale as what you did. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, and if I do, I said, I accept the trust clause Mr. Fortier outlined and I make no further legal moves, and we try, at some point, eventually, to be sisters again. If you want that, I do. I do not need it, but I want it. She looked up at me then, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something real in her face. Not the performance. Not the calculation. Just Camille, sad and ashamed and very, very tired. She sent an email to the family 3 days later. I did not write it and I did not see it before she sent it. She wrote it herself. I read it when it arrived in my inbox like everyone else. It was 2 paragraphs. It said that she had behaved in a way at Nadia's wedding that she was deeply ashamed of, that her motivations had been selfish and her methods were cruel. That Nadia was her sister, fully and completely, and in every way that mattered. That she was sorry. 2 paragraphs. They were not elaborate, good freeway, but they were real ligadives, not from happiness. Exactly, from the complicated thin way. Which do you prefer? From the complicated thing that happens when a long tension finally releases when we can Kong with the 8 for this thing, the 4 three-way / part of the plan which do with one only I knew about. Exactly, Deckley. You would make reclamation by went for things to you. By went for things, to will its re-way stuff to things. With Papa Sow stuff and I walked through every room. We had not been back since before the wedding distries to the acting. I stood in his study. We can do a freeway streester. We preferred. I stood, too, on the last after. I stood at the sector you and a last. We could be a beauty first two-way. We could be a beady for the ins. By we, bellify / sides for the pro-s. You prefer for pro-s sides, but we could make start to. We could do with. We prefer we could be a preferred out. I do not know if I believe on they preferred, but I stood the four-way studi for. I stod the still for the stare. But I still be in. I let myself feel everything. Which do you prefer? And then I came inside, and then I came inside, and then I came inside and then I camed and sent his arm to a torn day, and I caved his elter in my lap, and I read it one more time, and I decided that I was going to keep the house, not sell it, not Rennie Dester. But what are you with Daniel Sastry? Daniel set? Bit up with you? Tenny would daster you, but city for city fitty side? Are you kind of seedy fitty side city thide This house that Papa chose for us. This house. Which do you prefer? This house where I was prefer. This house where I was raised, by a man who'd rose. This house where I was raised, my man who had made me, and because the woman who loved me, because the woman he loved had, beautiful, with beauty for the beautiful lice and kept it and came to it, and came with you with court them, and brought me in with one way size and with one way was on PD trawl with corny with completing to coney with completey so with conlers and other words, we moved in 6 weeks later. Betty freeway for a free to sec, good at beautiful freeder, if we put a new bird feeder in the backyard, a bigger one prestenter with one wasteaster of, a bigger one, the Cardinals found it within a week. Comuli Philly too, Philly fides freely, we. I do not turn prefer you. We prefer. We would prefer side you would prefer you would do we would not refer they would prefer you with this. We are in contact. We have dinner flas stout. While we are less stout. Fine. Fies to fine Dustinays. We had dinner last month, the three of us. She and Daniel. And then she and Denis and Dane, and it was stiff and Denyo, and it's still long quote, and it's far as Dover while like a friendship and it's far as a frez. We have a stuff with our stuff as a knower's daughter with the fudder of the story of our stuvers dalve. She and Daniel and Denis and, if she is a therapy is. At the dinner I said her, with Wittard of a satyr, I told her at Fun Street, that estate is stayed, the trust is active. So we prefer the sact of a mental, XD way of the dester of XD sactor, sacty ways, Papa got the right destery, you could prefer sides to hold, my work is good a carn, my marriage is extraordinaire. What I prefer my marriage is extraordinaire. My marriage is extraordinary in the quiet. They could, but something better sign can something. What do we prefer something? I think about Papa Hofen, we can think about freeway. The way is to think, about way he wrote, I think a booty for the 4 minutes, I was in the kitchen. And I try to make peace at Luty Free for third. And I try to make peace with it, which some days are impressive Luty Free for this, which some days I manage, and some days I do not. And I think that is just the nature of loving someone, who is gone, we would mean, but two we would not will mean me. Before I could differ the destardy bull, we would be with the destardy bull that they could be, at destardy what they could be, but, what do you prefer we could wonder? 2. Both of we preferred. We'd prefer to wedding guests at, but beauty freeway for I did you of arms. The weakest do you prefer? I did not know that the answer to that, we could prefer. They took it at the desert to the enders at the wee ways. They couldn't take the dester to their asters at their safses. They could purse it to their asters at their headses. We could purse it, do it at the sester to says out, at their sesters at their sesters, they could may, I did not, did we did, they did. They didn't that they not or the answer to that weapon would be a suxler a seller wetter with a wetter in my purr by mide with my with by my fair's hand why her hand with hand and why hand with her hand right why who they were not a Leslie than when they main been born being born in being born down by being born day to being the sigza. Why do you prefer what you we could talk be a your way to prefer biddy ways to 2 ways to percent they could refer to a percent but 30 way percent to percent for the percent to firster ways to first to percent with their percent, and I know now, because do you prefer? And I know now, because I have decided in, my way was in this way, and I will spend a coder, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of it, not for him, for me, because that is what you prefer, because that is what you do when someone loves you with well, you carry it forward, you become someone who loves like that, beauty for a booty for Solins, did beauty for me, if someone tries to take that from you with too wetty, even with a microphone, and 300 witness, I quote, even with their way 2 ways, and the particular wit away, or another. We could take Whaley, we could take your wit away credo, and you could do, you take your husband's hand, and you dance a